Thank you very much. I think I should also apologize. If something is going to go wrong, it's going to go wrong. And I think why you're feeling so warm is that the AC at the back has decided to stop working this morning. But if you don't mind, especially those at the back, there is a technician who is between here and downstairs, so you may just want to give him space at the back as he tries to get to make sure that it's working. But the front is a little cooler, so that's your incentive to come closer, because this AC is in fact working. So unless you wanted to just demonstrate the climate change or what it's going to be like, I encourage you to come nearer to the front. Okay. All right. Very quickly, what I really am going to try to do is to set you a little bit of context for what we're doing today. Simply to suggest that climate change is an issue for the Caribbean region, and it is an issue. Because it is an issue, this discussion that we're having today is a relevant discussion. So that's all I'm going to do. As you can see from your program, I've really only been given 15 minutes, and to talk climate change and the Caribbean in 15 minutes is almost an impossibility. So what I'm really going to try to do is just give you what I call 3 takeaway messages. And what I'm arguing is that if you begin to talk climate change and the Caribbean, so you begin to put these two things in the same sentence and the same conversation, a lot of discussion is going to come up. And you're going to have a number of take-home messages. All I've done is taken out 3 of those take-home messages and say, when you have that discussion, here are 3 takeaway messages that you must not miss. And that's what I'm going to do. Leave these 3 takeaway messages quickly with you in the 15 minutes, and then we can, see how the rest of the discussion goes. Just to remind you, of course, that climate change in our discussion in the Caribbean is these distinct changes in measures of climate. For us, the measures of climate tend to be temperature and rainfall and wind speed. But also to point out that in the discussion in the Caribbean, there's a recognition that it is the distinct changes in these measures of climate due to human activity, and that's what you hear in the discussion in the Caribbean. So there are other things that can cause the climate to change, natural variations. You heard about the volcanic eruptions this morning, but the discussion in the Caribbean is a discussion about human activities and what it is doing to cause the climate to change. And of course, these human activities, burning of fossil fuels, it's a changing land use cover, but it's a key distinction that it's human activity. As we have heard, clearly the human activity is causing the greenhouse gases to go up. And I don't need to tell you this, the carbon dioxide, 40% since pre-industrial time, methane, 150%. But the greenhouse gases have been going up, concentrations have been going up. And as they have been going up, of course, they have been enhancing the greenhouse effect. And the enhancement of the greenhouse effect, of course, leads to things like warmer temperatures. So as the carbon dioxide goes up, the blue line, you can see that the mean temperature of the Earth is going up. You can see that the temperature of the Earth is increasing everywhere over the globe, whether it is land or ocean. But warmer temperatures are one of the key side effects. Changes in rainfall patterns all over the globe. Some places are getting wetter, which are the green. Some places are getting drier. And of course, the rising sea levels, which you have often heard about. So it's that context in which I want to tell you these 3 take-home messages when you talk climate change and the Caribbean. The context of long-term changes in measures of climate, but long-term changes due to human actions. Here are 3 of the takeaway messages when you have that discussion in the context of the Caribbean. So what's takeaway message number 1? It's a very simple message. It's takeaway message number 1 because it is simply this: take note. So message number 1 is take note. Our climate is changing. And that's the first message that you get when you talk about climate change and the Caribbean. What is this message? What do you hear in the discussion? You hear this. I could poll you each today, and I am sure that one of the things I would get from you is that we have entered into what we call a new regime of unfamiliar climate variability. I don't need to ask you. If I ask you, are you hot? Your answer is going to be absolutely. And it is, I was saying to our guest yesterday, it's hot for us too in Jamaica, and we are used to hot. So the first thing is that we are entering this regime of unfamiliar climate variability. Our climate is not behaving as it used to. How do we know this? Well, the science tells us firstly that it has gotten hotter. And so if you look at the daytime temperatures, everywhere throughout the Caribbean, the red triangle is up, it's statistically significant, and it's everywhere throughout the Caribbean, and you can see the rise on the right-hand side. But even more significant for us, it's the nighttime temperatures that are going up, and they're going up at a faster rate than the daytime temperatures. And I keep saying this is significant for us as Caribbean people because we live in our AC offices during the day. But at night we go home and the first thing we do now is turn on the fan. But the fan then runs straight through the night as opposed to you getting up in the middle of the night and turning it off. Climate change now becomes an energy issue. But it's an unfamiliar pattern for us. So it's gotten much hotter. But we do have about the 1 degree rise since pre-industrial time. But we feel it in the daytime and the nighttime temperatures. The other way it has become unfamiliar to us is that our rainfall pattern has become way more variable. If we look on total rainfall, it's true, you don't actually see a pattern. We are not actually in a dry or wetter phenomenon, and that's because of the variability. What we actually have seen, especially in the last 10 to 15 years, is that we are swinging between extremes. So last year was a drought, but so was 2010, and so was 2005, and so was 1997. And you get the pattern that we swing between these extreme, long, extended droughts, and then we swing into flood conditions thereafter, and there never seems to be a normal anymore. But it's not only that the pattern has become more variable, how the rainfall or the nature of the rainfall is also changing. Rainfall has become more intense in recent times. So you get these stretches of dry, and then after the stretches of dry, you get this intense downpour. And so the nature and character of how the rainfalls is also changing. So that's, again, not a pattern we're used to. We are not used to droughts that begin from the previous December and last through to the next December. We are used to dry periods, but not year-long droughts. And that is one of the changes we have seen. A third way in which we know that our climate has entered this kind of unfamiliar pattern, building on the droughts, is we've seen more extremes. So the droughts are one of the extremes that we're seeing more of. But I use the storms as well. So I use Jamaica. Between 1980 and 1999, 4 storms have passed within 200 kilometers of us. But between 2000 and present, 13 have passed within 200 kilometers of us. Not all of this is necessarily climate related, because you do have natural cycles of variation. But certainly there's a role that climate change is playing, and certainly a role in the intensity of these storms. So we're tending to see more climate extremes. And then the last way, of course, is that we are seeing higher sea levels. And again, we're not used to this. Our sea levels are rising at a rate of about 3.5 millimeters per year. Hold the millimeters. It doesn't sound like much, but hold it, 3.5 millimeters per year since 1993, double the rate before that. And again, we use this diagram to show you what the impact of that is. The green dotted line is where the beach was in 1971. You can see the red line where the beach is in 2003. And that's Negril, just in case you are wondering. The famed and contentious Negril. Anyway, I didn't say that, right? But you get the idea that we must take note because our climate is changing. We are in a regime of unfamiliar climate variability. It's unfamiliar because of the magnitude of the changes we are seeing. It's unfamiliar because of the timing, the dry is lasting longer. It's unfamiliar because of the frequency, so we're seeing more storms in a shorter period of time. Our climate is changing, and we are not familiar with the way it is changing. The question is then, so why am I saying that the take-home message is take note? So why should you take notice of this? Very quickly and simply, take note because, as I always argue, the Caribbean is an extremely climate-sensitive place. And I don't need much to make the case. We know it is sensitive because if I show you the rainfall pattern, which is the bars, you know we're dry between January, February, March, and wet between April, May, June, July, August, September, October, November, right? True? It turns out that we know we're hottest in July, August, true? We don't expect it to be this hot, but we know we expect it to be hot. What we do is just embed our lives, or pattern our lives around this. And so we plant around this. I wanted to tackle the Minister Week. We supposedly patch roads around this and clean drains around this pattern. We give holidays around this pattern. But even without us thinking about it, our lives become wrapped around the pattern of climate. And so climate becomes an integral part of our everyday existence, even without us thinking about it. If that were not enough, we are small islands, and we either have hilly interiors or narrow coastal plains. And so life only exists on a steep hillside or a narrow coastal plain. And it doesn't matter which one you take, when the climate changes, if you get heavy rains and you are on the hillside, don't bother run to the plain because all you need is a good storm to simply cause a flooding. We don't have a choice. Climate is embedded as a part of who we are, simply because we are a small island. Think where all our major towns are. Think where our major road network is. Think about the ringing, the GPS power stations and sublines. Can't escape climate. And then, of course, lastly, our livelihood, well-being, and water is wrapped up in climate. What do we make our livelihoods out of? Agriculture, tourism. Can you see the climate link? Yeah, you must answer me though. Can you see the climate link? Think about our health. I mean, dengue, asthma, you can also see the climate link. And then think about critical livelihood sectors like water and energy, especially water. Water in the Caribbean is linked to rainfall. No rainfall, no water. If you put all of these three things together, Jamaica is extremely climate sensitive. You cannot escape climate sensitivity. And so, what happens when we have an unfamiliar climate as we are having now? It's simply transforming our sensitivity into a major vulnerability. Let me just illustrate it for you. You remember that 2014 drought in Jamaica? Here are the headlines from the Observer. Well, when the drought started, you expected some of these because you expected the food shortages. After all, our agriculture is rain-fed to a large extent. You expected the water, well, you expected the fires, right? After a while, it just became too dry. And so we began to have 75% of calls related to the bushfires. What happens as it progresses, however? Suddenly schools start to close down because there's water lock-offs. Can you now begin to see that the expected sensitivities are now expanding? So education now begins to suffer as a result of an unfamiliar climate. Then the hydro energy gets cut and there were power outages in Portmore. Can you begin to see it now stretching to energy? And then, of course, the car wash businesses have to begin to cut staff to stay afloat. And the drought hits the business owners. Can you now begin to see the impact on livelihoods? And then, of course, the longer the drought lasted, you began to see drought slows economic growth. It is transforming the sensitivity, which is a part of who we are, and turning it into a major vulnerability. That's what the unfamiliar climate is doing to us. All right, so for that reason, I say if you're having the conversation about climate change and the Caribbean, the first takeaway message is just simply take note. Our climate is changing. We have to take note of that. What's the second takeaway message that I think this conversation, if you're having? If the first message is take note, our climate is changing already. It's impacting every sphere of our existence. You know what the second message is? It's this: take account. Our climate will continue to change. And I have to explain this one, all right? But it's take account. Our climate will keep changing. So the kind of work we do, I think most of you know it, is climate modeling. And climate modeling says, well, I take some computer models which code all of the physical world in it, you know, how the winds move, etc., etc. Give it some scenarios or storylines about how the greenhouse gas concentrations will change. A worst case scenario, you go up to the middle of the century and come down, or best case rather, you go up to the middle of the century and then the greenhouse gas concentrations come down. And a worst case, it just keeps going up and up and up, which seems like the likely case right now. and then use them and see if we can come up with possible future climate. So you can understand, we don't know how the climate is changed. We have a best case future climate and a worst case future climate. What do we see for the Caribbean? Well, it's not a pretty picture, I warn you, from, from before. The first thing is, of course, hotter times are ahead for us. So if you think you feel hot now, but by the end of the century, the projection is anywhere between 1 and 4 degrees. I told you we have changed by 1 degree in the mean up to now. And the idea is the bottom is the better case and the top is the worst case. Anywhere it's really dark, it's just hot. 30 to 98% of our days annually are going to be hot by current standards. Interpretation, summer all year round. This kind of summer all year round. Only 2% cool. The picture is one of unprecedented climate change. Climate change as we have not seen yet. All right, and the unprecedented becomes important. What's the picture? Drier conditions. All right, so we still have variable rainfall, but much less of it. Anywhere is brown, so you know again the better case, the worst case, and you can see the Caribbean is just covered in brown. And in the mean, we're 30% drier in the Caribbean. On a country level, that goes up 50 to 60% drier on a country level. All right, and it depends again on where you are. What is it? Shorter rainy season, I think that's 6 to 8% shorter rainy season, a corresponding lengthening of the dry season, and longer and more severe droughts. That's not a pretty picture, but that's the idea of what we are looking on, unprecedented climate change. What else? More intense events. I borrowed this from Bender et al. Again, it's showing you category 4 and 5 storms in the present, modeled category 4 and 5 storms in the future under a warmer climate. The idea is not more storms, it's more intense storms. And that again looks, strong storms with higher rainfall rates and stronger winds. And then of course, higher sea levels. I don't know if you can see the diagram, but everywhere in blue is a piece of Jamaica that's gone under, I think, 1 to 5 meters sea level. Yeah, you can recognize Portmore, so if anybody live in Portmore, right? And you can recognize the South Coast vulnerability. And from the Carib Safe study, 2 meters, 1% land area lost, 1% people displaced, presumably those who live in those areas, 20% of our power plants, 18% of our tourism, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That's the kind of picture we are looking on, unprecedented climate change. All right? So, again, why is the take-home message, take account? If that's the picture of how our climate will likely continue to change if we sit back and do nothing, then why is the take-home message, take account? It's this, because unprecedented climate means unprecedented climate impacts. So we have seen the impacts of climate already, but we haven't seen what an unprecedented, a 1 to 4 degree climate, warmer temperature, 30% drier, 2 meter sea level rise is likely to be. And the impacts are going to have some interesting characteristics. One, they're going to be pervasive. So as much as the sensitivity I proved to you is pervasive throughout all of society, so will the impacts. There's no area of society that is going to be left untouched. If it's going to be pervasive, it's also going to be expanding. And I showed it to you. There are people who are now becoming vulnerable who were previously not vulnerable. So they're what I call the new climate vulnerable, not just people. Let me tell you who are the new climate vulnerable. Outdoor workers. Think of a security guard who has to stand in a parking lot now. That's the new climate vulnerable. Think of our historic buildings that were never built to withstand the kind of strength. Those are in our new climate vulnerable. All right, and you can think of parts of our natural life, our biodiversity that were not meant to withstand, certain extremes. You can see that the vulnerable people or the climate vulnerable are rapidly expanding. And then perhaps the last thing about these impacts, unprecedented impacts, is that they're not equally distributed. There are some people who are going to suffer more from a 2-degree rise in temperature than others who can perhaps afford to do something about it. The impacts are not equally distributed. So Unprecedented climate change is unprecedented impacts that are pervasive, expanding, and unequally distributed. So then, this leads to my note. That is why I say, with unprecedented climate, life as we now know it is under serious threat in the future. We therefore must account for climate in our developmental planning. We cannot not account for climate, all right? And hence the message, take account. 4 areas quickly that I say stand out. Water. We need to deal with water in the Caribbean region, and we must account for climate in water. We already have a challenge to deliver safe and adequate water. It's only going to grow. Food security, all right? Climate will not all be negative. Some areas will become favorable. In fact, this is a study that shows that the green areas become more favorable to planting certain crops, and the brown areas become unfavorable. If you know Jamaica, you know those green areas are protected forests. But what is a challenge if that becomes more favorable and we need, anyway, I'm not going there. All right? Agriculture, coastal infrastructure and livelihoods. We cannot escape that we need to deal with coastal infrastructure. And any new significant piece of infrastructure we are building now must account for climate. And then, of course, I use health. And I use it because, of course, the big thing right now is all right, whichever one you want, mosquito, Zigbee, exactly. But it's not just the mosquito, and it's not just asthma, it's also the impacts after storms and the challenge to deliver adequate health care in already overburdened system. I think you see my point. The second takeaway message, if the first takeaway message is simply take note, our climate is changing, then the second takeaway message is take account of climate in our development planning, because our climate will keep changing. Very quickly then, what's the last takeaway message? I think you could almost guess it. The last takeaway message, if the first one is take note and the second is take account, absolutely take action. Our climate demands change. And that's the third message you get from the conversation about climate change and the Caribbean. Why we must take action, I simplified. We can't know what we know about how climate is and will later alter Caribbean life and existence and do nothing. If I know what I have just told you and told you, then how can we sit down and do nothing? So that's why. Who must take action? Boy, all scales. Clearly there must be action on the global level. There are some aspects of this that we need global consensus. That's the Paris Agreement. Clearly there must be regional, because we must make sure that the Caribbean's point of view is reflected in the global action. Clearly there must be national action and community, because it is at these levels that we feel climate change. And clearly you need to take action as individuals. The interesting thing is it's easier to get to you. The likelihood of action is this way going out. But anyway, who must take action is clear. What kind of action, and I think this is where we're leading into, I think I've established that climate change is an issue for the Caribbean region. And so the question is, what kind of action? In the Caribbean, our discussion centers around, first of all, mitigation. That's a discussion we have been having. What can we do to reduce the amount of greenhouse gases? And we have been centering on energy, waste, and forests. This workshop is putting a different perspective in. Should we also be looking on something like solar radiation management? But all of those have been where our focus has been. Our focus has also been very heavily on adaptation, a recognition that the climate is changing and we must, and we're going to have to live with it. All right? Even if we do the best actions now. For example, farming practices, seawalls, water harvesting, renewed policies, changing in order to live with climate. And then, of course, our focus has also been on education. What can we do to engender behavioral change? Because both mitigation and adaptation is really asking people to change how they do things. All right, how do we make people conscious, convicted, and convinced about the issues? That's where our efforts have been centered. Put this workshop in that context. Does this add a new element to where our efforts should be centered? Lastly then, are there any characteristics of the action? I'm just throwing some things out there for you. So when we take action in these areas and in this new area that we're talking about, should there be any characteristics? I think so, and I leave them with you. Action must be impactful but sensitive, all right? And that sensitivity not just for human beings, but for the rest of the natural world. It has to be transformative. We have to really transform. And in this case, I'm talking about transforming from just recovering after an incident to resilience. You will hear the word resilience talk about. But it has to be just. Because certain actions can give unequal advantage to certain people. So as we think about the actions and think about this action, think about that as well. Transformative action, but just. Urgent, but timely. There's clearly a need to act now, but there's also a need to figure out when that action is best put in place. It must acknowledge responsibility and responsibilities. And I make the distinction. So we must acknowledge the causes, and it must acknowledge who must deal with them. So both the responsibility and the responsibilities. The action has to be inclusive as opposed to prescriptive. We have done enough prescriptive responses and know what it has done when we don't include the people. And then I add technological but human. All right? We clearly need some technological solutions. Solutions that perhaps are not even on the table, but it can't be all technological without considering the human factor. So here are my takeaways. When you're talking climate change in the Caribbean, first takeaway message is take note. Our climate is already changing in unfamiliar ways, and so we must take note. 2, take account. Take account of climate in development planning because our climate will keep changing. And then take action. We can't know what we know and not do nothing. Our climate demands that we change. Thank you very much.